Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, and a big thank you to Roy Edwards for his recent email about the Huawei release and offering me an alternative view on the subject. I think it's so important, so please keep those emails coming in. Now, you guys sharing your input is so important to this show. And I'm quite excited about getting today's guest on too. One, because he's one of my favourite past guests and all-round good guy. And two, because it's the first time I'm going to try and use my tech to be more efficient. When I got the last-minute notification to go to Munich, it meant that I had to cancel this podcast. But then it occurred to me, what if, when I arrived at Birmingham New Street train station, what if I found somewhere fairly quiet and recorded the podcast from my phone from the station and then edit it on the plane? And that's exactly what I did. So my friend Duncan joins me today against all the odds to talk about how at Patsnap they recently secured Series D investment and have been working hard on continuing to open up big data insights to accelerate R&D and innovation. And I also learned how one of the most exciting projects has been the Patsnap Academy, which is their free online learning centre which educates startups, innovators, entrepreneurs, researchers, scientists and R&D teams about innovation and IP best practices. But enough from me. Let's get Duncan back on the show to find out more. A massive warm welcome back to the show, Duncan. It's 2 years since we last spoke, which I can't believe. But can you remind the listeners a little more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Duncan Clark. I head up Academy by Patsnap. Academy by Patsnap is actually an online learning platform. So it's an online learning platform that teaches about innovation best practices. Really, that's based on a business strategy that I would say puts intellectual property at its heart. So if you recall from when we spoke last time, Patsnap is a intellectual property database. So intellectual property is very much at the core of what we do. But certainly on the Academy side of things, we'll talk about a little bit more about that later on.
The last time we spoke, Duncan, I learned about how your software as a service platform leverages artificial intelligence, neural networks, machine learning and natural language processing to correlate patterns, images and chemical structure similarities into an intuitive, easy-to-use platform for research and development. And it does seem to me incredible that it was, 2 years since we last spoke, because these are all big industry buzzwords now. So it seems that you were somewhat ahead of your time, because it seems everywhere we look, AI and machine learning is everywhere. So I've got to ask, what were the biggest changes that you've seen in that time?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And you're absolutely right. The 2 years have flown by, and I think we really have seen some quite phenomenal changes. I think on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't always feel like that, but we're perhaps going to look back at this time in sort of 25 years' time and say that was really when the AI switch was flipped on. And the reason I say that, I guess, is because certainly what we've seen from our perspective is that the interest level in artificial intelligence, for example, that is an area that certainly moved from what we saw as perhaps a very general level of interest beforehand to an ever-increasing number of actual applications. Now, when I talk about artificial intelligence here, I am talking about this perhaps in its broader sense. So I'm thinking about things like the machine learning aspects, things like image recognition, pattern recognition, some of those different technologies that you mentioned in the introduction there, things like machine learning and so on. And I think what's happened is that certainly organizations have for a long time been aware of the kind of need to think about artificial intelligence, but it's always been a bit of a future consideration. It's always been quite a broad theme. And that has certainly moved in the last couple of years significantly towards a lot of tactical deployments that we're now seeing. And these are tactical deployments that organizations are actually talking about as well, in terms of they are bringing that into public awareness. So if I were to think of some examples of this, one of the organizations come up in our world of patents and intellectual property would be the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO for short. And then when we look at some of the things that they're doing there in terms of a tactical deployment of AI, one of the kind of workflows that they have to do is when they receive patents or patent applications, they have to determine what technology category these applications belong to. And traditionally, that's always been done by a human. They've got a big program running now whereby you can automate that process, and based on the machine learning and looking at patterns, you can actually do that through artificial intelligence. So all of that process becomes automated. So it's certainly not an end-to-end replacement of the human with artificial intelligence, but there are those instances of these targeted use cases that we're seeing. And I think another part of this is the growing use of artificial intelligence in what I would consider more conservative sectors or more conservative industries. So, for example, when you look at the increasing interest within the legal industry, for example, I think this really is indicating a step change in the use of artificial intelligence. And that's before we even get into the world of when we think about innovation and things like DNA sequencing or using artificial intelligence to find target molecules for drugs in the future, and all of that kind of activity.
And what about your work with big data insights to accelerate research and development and innovation? How is that journey evolving for you?
So with regards to when we think about big data and using big data to specifically accelerate R&D, as we spoke about last time, a big focus for Patsnap is being able to unlock insights and conclusions from patents. But I think when we think about patent data or innovation data, or even as we're calling it now, innovation intelligence, it goes much further than the information that is solely disclosed in patents alone. So, and here I'm thinking, for example, things like research papers. There are pieces of university research. We have clinical trials in healthcare. There's government grant information where they're providing support and funding to specific research projects, market reports, things like tech blogs such as yourself, for example, Neil, all of the very rich sources of information that help when it comes to forming a view of the market. So I think linking all of this information to the already rich world of patents is an absolutely key.
So can you tell me a little bit more how you recently secured Series D investment? It sounds incredibly exciting for you guys.
As you're aware, we recently received Series D investment. And this, for us, has been used to launch actually a brand new platform that brings all of these worlds together. It's what's known in the industry as NPLs. That's non-patent literature that complements the patent literature, which is super important in the world of research and development. So this new platform, it's a platform called Discovery. It gives a more holistic view of competitor technologies, things like market intelligence outside of IP data. It brings in data such as market sizing, what different companies are active, what are the key scientific publications and the information from those, mergers, acquisitions. All of that kind of information comes into an innovation hub that allows the users to easily see the relationships between all of these different multiple sources. So what's the benefit of that? I think the key thing is with this wider market analysis, it gives a much more detailed level of due diligence, and this is absolutely important when organizations and companies are looking to bring new innovations to the market. They need all of that type of information, but they also need to be able to analyze that information in a very efficient manner in order to take business decisions. I'll give you an example of that in practice. Let's say you're trying to understand a market area. So, for instance, who are the influencers? How do they all relate to each other? We have a relationship mapping feature. That's probably one of the most popular functions within our Discovery platform, because it gives information such as who has invested in which startups, what are the links between all of the different influences within a specific in a specific area, which VCs have invested the most in a specific technology area. So where does that interest lie for specific VCs? Who have worked on joint research programs together? So all of those kind of relationships that you can begin to map to get an understanding of a specific technology area. And added to that, all of that within a platform helps with the collaboration and working together on global research projects, which is absolutely key as an organization grows.
Now, I recently read about your free online learning centre. I think it's called the Patsnap Academy. But can you expand on that just for listeners and help them visualise the kind of work that you're doing?
Yes, absolutely. So Patsnap Academy, as I mentioned in my introduction, is it's an area that's very close to my heart. It's an online innovation best practice training centre is probably the best way to describe it. It offers free education for its users. You don't need to be a Patsnap user. You can simply sign up to get access to all of this material. In terms of what we do, we believe that the foundation stone for what we're calling best innovation practices starts with intellectual property. So within this project and the material that we're offering, we're not training people to be lawyers or patent attorneys or anything like that. We're teaching people what I think actually is the real fun part of intellectual property. It's how it relates to business strategy. So we're helping organizations train their R&D teams, upskill various other parts of the organization, right the way through to innovators, so lone innovators and entrepreneurs that are sort of just beginning to embark on this world of intellectual property, and also how it relates to protecting their ideas and then successfully commercializing those ideas. Now, the way in which we do that, we provide courses using guest speakers who come from all sorts of different types of organizations, actually. They come from consultancies, universities, non-governmental bodies, and so on and so forth. Now, all of our guest speakers that come onto Academy have in-depth scientific, litigation or commercial backgrounds, and all of those heavily intersect with intellectual property. So once you log onto the platform, what you would see is it's got bite-sized videos. They're all arranged into courses and modules so people can easily track their learning and their progress. There's quizzes at the end of each module so people can test their knowledge to ensure that they understand all of these key concepts. And as I mentioned, it's an on-demand service, so people can complete it in their own time. They can come back to it as and when they will.
Again, for listeners tuning in and hearing about you guys for the first time, what are the main challenges that you're helping your customers overcome?
Yeah, so I think in terms of some of the main challenges, one of the things that we have learned is that organizations realize that intellectual property is a fuel for innovation, and it's something that actually provides a lot of the intangible assets for a business. So there is a need for people to understand what their relationship with intellectual property is. On the other hand, though, intellectual property training is something that's quite difficult and it's actually very expensive to roll out. So I think in terms of what we're able to help companies with is just bringing this information to all of the different units that will be touched by intellectual property. So here I'm thinking about things like, let's take marketing as an example. You know, what is their approach towards trademarks and how are they protecting those? What trade secrets are being discussed perhaps in meetings with potential suppliers? How is that governed within an organization? Who is ultimately responsible for managing things like IP risk and also the rollout of education programs? Things like corporate governance. Is IP audited correctly? Do people know what intellectual property they have? Right the way through to things like, are you taking the right form of protection against growing and new threats actually from areas such as cyber hacking and so on. So this type of training is expensive. Quite often it might require workshops, so we're talking time away from the desk, the added cost of having to bring in subject areas. So that's really difficult to keep up as an organization. So one of the main things that we're hoping to do here is take away some of that pain with our online training center so that all employees can learn at their own pace and in their own time and get to grips with what is actually a fascinating topic.
So what is the secret to accelerating innovation in a business and making better business decisions with intellectual property data, and what that brings, having that at your fingertips?
Absolutely, yes, I would agree. It is a difficult balance to get right. I think in terms of accelerating innovation within a business, and when you look at most organizations across the world and most companies across the world, all of them will say something like, they are striving to become the number one global leader in research or innovation for whichever area it may be, area X, Y, or Z. So I think knowing that it's a culture that people want to create, one of the main things that companies need to think about is how do you actually create that culture? Because culture is quite an easy word to say, but as we know in the business world, if you haven't connected it to a metric or an objective that's measurable, it's quite difficult to know whether you really are sort of achieving that that day-to-day move towards becoming more innovative, and whether that really is built into the fabric of the company. So I would say in order to be able to make those better business decisions with intellectual property, part one of this is there's probably three parts. Part one would be around the education. So first of all, people being aware of or understanding even the types of information and the breadth of information that's available and the type of business questions that it answers. Certainly from a research perspective, as we know, if you don't have a very targeted approach to research, it can quite often proliferate into a really perhaps mammoth task that feels perhaps too big to unpick. So it's about understanding actually and having the training around how do you approach that type of task. So education would be number one. What information is available and how should it be used? I think another aspect to this is also the cross-functional communication that needs to be built up across different departments. As I mentioned earlier, intellectual property is something that touches upon every unit of an organization, whether that's sales, marketing, IT, and all of those different areas. One of the key things that you need to ensure that works is cooperation and communication between those different departments. So all those things that will help to organizations to understand, not just how that locks in with the legal side of things, but how they can actually build that into their day-to-day. And that's the only way really you can build out a holistic intellectual property strategy if you're thinking at strategy level. And then the third thing is, and this goes right back to what we were talking about at the beginning, when you're thinking about things like artificial intelligence, it's thinking about what are some of the targeted applications of AI that we could use, and link that also to business outcomes. So this is a bit of an experimentation process, I believe, that needs to take place. So you can take, let's say, not the end-to-end workflow, but you take parts of a specific workflow, and then you could test AI within that specific part of the workflow, measure the results. If it works, that's great, and you can do more of it. If it doesn't work, you can look for other applications. And I think that's the way we're going to see AI being adopted by organizations.
And one of the things I love doing on this tech podcast is busting a few myths and laying them to rest once and for all. So I've got to ask, are there any myths around intellectual property that you can finally lay to rest today?
I think that's a great question. And actually, yes, there is one. And for me, it's a really big one. And it's this idea that intellectual property is boring. And I think it's one of those things that as soon as you mention the word IP, it's like, right, we have to bolt the doors to keep everybody in the room. It's a little bit similar to when you might mention tax or something like that. And actually, I think that is the, unfortunately, it's the impression that people have, but it is totally wrong. Particularly when you look at some of the discussions that we've had with our guest experts on Patsnap Academy. When you link intellectual property to the more exciting things, such as business strategy, there's all sorts of stories that come out of that in terms of the experiences that people have had. And if I give a few examples here, there's always those stories of the kind of David and Goliath challenges that have taken place in the courts, where the smaller guy has taken on the big guns in the market and won those cases. And how they've used intellectual property as part of that journey is absolutely fascinating stories. It's the sort of thing that I always sort of think that, if HBO or Netflix are looking for their next big TV hit, certainly some of these things that have taken place, if you look at some of the legal stories behind intellectual property, are absolutely fascinating how it's played out. I think the main thing is, in terms of the myths around IP, lots of organizations, including startups and entrepreneurs, their first interaction with IP tends to be associated with something negative happening. And that's usually when it's kind of too late to start thinking about intellectual property. I think the main thing that I'd like to see happen is that people have fewer initial negative experiences with intellectual property. So they're actually sort of baking that into early strategy as part of protecting and then successfully commercializing their inventions and taking those to market. So similar to perhaps when you go into a shop and you might buy a product, as consumers, we know that automatically by doing that, we inherit certain rights as the consumer. And I think it's interesting that you've got organizations, global ones like the WIPO, the UK Intellectual Property Office, that are also protecting rights that we have. So as soon as, for example, as an entrepreneur, we have developed something valuable that we can take out to market, also the rights to those are being protected by certain organizations. And it's about time we made use of those rights and put them to good use, good commercial use as well, I think.
We've mentioned a few times it's been 2 years since we last spoke, and we've fully caught up with where you are now. But what's next for Patsnap? Is there anything else you can share about the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as we spoke about, we are now on this journey with artificial intelligence. So I think for Patsnap, what we're looking to do is to work with R&D teams across the world. So work with our clients and customers, continue to find out what some of their main requirements are, because we've got the ability to invest in further developments in artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of those image processing tools, in order to be able to enhance and accelerate those innovation rates for those R&D teams. So I think the main thing is really again looking at ways in which we can use artificial intelligence in ways that actually enhance the efficiencies that we have in a lot of these processes. So, I think again for 2020, that will be some of the key activity that we see.
So I cannot thank you enough, Duncan, for coming back on the podcast today. But for everybody listening, we've covered a lot of ground today, a lot of interesting topics, and I think there's going to be a lot of listeners want to find out more information, and I know that you can help them in this area. So can you just point them in the direction of where they can find you online, and also the best way to contact a member of your team if they're left with any additional questions?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways actually in which they can do this. Now, Academy, by the way, because it is an education center and it's a free resource, it does offer a whole support community around our guest speakers and other contributors to the platform. So in order to get involved with that, number one, you can visit academy.patsnap.com. That will give you the ability to have access to that community and all of the tools and resources that we've got there. So as I mentioned, there's links there to expert speakers. People can join in the discussions. There's lots of articles, frameworks to download. So if you want to apply this to your business and take it into a meeting to try out some of the advice that's given, those can be downloaded. Quizzes, as I mentioned, and so on and so forth. So that's one way. We also have the community is present on LinkedIn. It's one of the showcase pages. So it's linkedin.com/showcase/Patsnap-Academy. So a number of ways in which you can reach out to us. And then also directly, of course, my email address is dclark@patsnap.com.
Well, as we approach 1,000 episodes, Duncan, this one is the first that we've recorded and made happen inside a train station. So I thank you for that. I love everything that you guys are doing and how you're empowering innovators to learn how to protect and commercialize their ideas. It's invaluable work. It really is, especially in this day and age, this digital age. So thanks for joining me today, Duncan. And let's not leave it 2 years until we speak again. Thanks for coming on.
No problem. No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Academy by Patsnap was launched in December 2017 to empower innovators. to learn more about how they can protect and commercialise their ideas. And it now has thousands of students and professionals registered on the platform. And I hope anyone interested in innovation or the fundamental basics of intellectual property and how to pursue, protect and commercialise their ideas and understand the actual value of IP to their business, I hope anybody interested in those topics found today's conversation useful. But if you need more information or have any additional questions, please reach out to Duncan directly because, like I said at the beginning of the show, he's one of the nicest guys that you're likely to meet and incredibly helpful. So I think we pulled off today's remote podcast recording and a big thank you to everyone for your patience and Duncan for helping making it a success too. And as we're approaching 1,000 episodes, I want to include some of your voices for that celebratory episode so we can celebrate in style. So if you'd like to record me a few seconds wishing the show for the best, simply record something on your phone using WhatsApp, iMessage or your app of choice. And email me the audio message to techblogwriter@outlook.com or tweet me at Neil C. Hughes. But that's it from me today. So a big thank you to everyone for that tuned in. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.